You wake up before sunrise. Still dark outside. The air is cold. You have maybe 10 minutes to get ready before you need to leave. You don't know exactly what time you'll get home tonight. You never do. That's not something your employer tells you in advance. You work until the work is done. And if the work isn't done, you stay. You'll be on your feet for most of the day. 12 hours, maybe 14. In summer, the room you work in will be unbearably hot. In winter, it won't be much warmer than outside. The machines around you are loud enough that after a few years, your hearing starts to go. You don't complain about this. Not out loud. If you do, you don't come back tomorrow. And if you don't come back tomorrow, your family doesn't eat. There is no law telling your employer how long they can make you work. There is no minimum wage. No safety inspector. No sick day. No workers' compensation if you lose a finger, and people do lose fingers. You are not protected. You are just necessary. For now, this wasn't illegal. This was normal. This is what work looked like in America before labor laws. In the mid to late 1800s, most working Americans had one defining feature of their daily lives, almost no control over it. The typical workday in industrial America ran between 12 and 16 hours, 6 days a week. That wasn't an exception. It wasn't the result of a busy season or a special project. It was just the schedule. Every week. Every month. Every year. Sunday was the only day off, and in many households, that day was consumed by the work of survival: washing clothes, mending things, preparing food. There was very little time that belonged to you. Factory floors were the center of this world. By the 1880s, millions of Americans worked in textile mills, steel plants, coal mines, meatpacking facilities, glass factories, and garment shops. These were not clean or comfortable places. They were loud, dark, and often dangerous. Textile mills, for example, filled the air with fine cotton dust. Workers breathed it in for years. Many developed serious lung conditions over time. There was no name for it in common use then. It was just what happened to people who worked in mills long enough. In steel plants, workers operated near open furnaces that burned at temperatures high enough to melt metal. The heat was described by workers of the time as something that made the air feel solid. Shifts in steel could run 12 hours, and for many years, plants operated on a rotating schedule where workers would pull a 24-hour shift every 2 weeks just to swap from day to night rotations. This was not considered unusual. It was simply how the industry ran. The pace was set by the machines, not by the people. When the machines ran, you ran. When they stopped, sometimes you were allowed to eat. Many workers ate standing up or didn't eat at all until the end of the shift. There were no formal breaks written into any agreement. There was no agreement. You showed up, you worked, you were paid for the hours your employer decided to pay you for. That was the arrangement. It wasn't just men. By the late 1800s, women made up a significant portion of the industrial workforce. In textile mills across New England, women, many of them young, some as young as their early teens, worked alongside men doing the same physical labor for noticeably lower pay. This was not a temporary situation. It was a standard feature of how wages were set. Women were paid less because employers could pay them less, and there was no law preventing that. Families sent their daughters to work in mills because they had to. In a household where every adult or near adult was expected to contribute, wages from a textile mill, however small, could mean the difference between keeping a roof and losing it. And then there were children. Child labor in industrial America was widespread, documented, and legal. In the early 1900s, the U.S. Census Bureau estimated that roughly 2 million children under the age of 16 were employed in some form of industrial or agricultural labor. In coal mines, boys as young as 8 or 9 worked as breaker boys. Their job was to sit over moving conveyor belts and pick out pieces of slate and rock from the coal as it moved past them. They did this for 10 hours a day. Their hands bled. Their backs curved. Breaker rooms were full of coal dust and noise. In glass factories, boys worked near furnaces in the middle of the night. Glass blowing required high heat around the clock, and children were used because they were small enough to maneuver close to the molds and cheap enough that it made financial sense to employers. In textile mills, small children were used as scavengers, crawling under running machinery to collect loose cotton that had fallen to the floor. The machines were not stopped when they did this. Stopping machines cost money. Families did not send their children into these conditions because they were indifferent to their well-being. They sent them because poverty left few options. In many working-class households, a child's wage was a meaningful portion of total family income. Without it, the family fell short. This was the reality that labor reformers would later spend decades trying to change. The physical environment of industrial work before safety regulations was genuinely dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate today. There were no required machine guards, no safety switches, no emergency shutoffs that were standard or required. Machinery that could remove a hand or crush a limb ran openly, operated by workers who had often been trained only briefly, if at all. Industrial accidents were common enough that they were treated as an ordinary cost of the work. Textile workers got fingers caught in looms. Steel workers were burned by molten metal splashes. Miners were trapped or killed by collapses. In the meatpacking industry, workers used large knives at high speed in cold, slippery conditions. Cuts were expected. The year 1911 produced one of the most documented industrial disasters of that era. On March 25th, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. The building was a garment factory, 9 and 10 floors up, filled mostly with young immigrant women. The fire spread quickly because of the fabric scraps on the floor. Many of the exit doors had been locked by management, a common practice meant to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing small amounts of fabric. 146 workers died. Many jumped from windows. Others were found at the locked doors. The Triangle Fire became a turning point in public awareness, but it was not an isolated event. It was the most visible example of conditions that existed in workplaces across the country. Mining was its own category of danger. Between 1900 and 1910, American coal mines averaged more than 2,000 deaths per year. That number reflects only fatalities, not the far larger number of serious injuries, crushed limbs, or cases of black lung disease that developed slowly over years. The Monongah mining disaster of 1907 in West Virginia killed at least 362 men and boys in a single explosion. It remains the deadliest industrial accident in American history. Federal investigation afterward found a range of safety failures. There were no federal mining safety laws at the time. If a worker was injured on the job, they typically bore the full cost themselves. There was no workers' compensation system in place at the federal level until well into the 20th century. Losing the ability to work due to injury often meant losing income entirely. Illness from workplace conditions was even harder to address because the connection between certain environments and certain diseases wasn't always understood at the time, and even when it was, there was no legal mechanism forcing employers to change anything. Here is what did not exist for most of American industrial history before the 1930s. There was no federal minimum wage. Employers paid what they chose to pay, and workers accepted it or left. In practice, leaving was difficult when work was scarce, and when moving to another city or industry wasn't financially possible for most families. There were no federal limits on working hours. Some states passed their own 10-hour or 8-hour laws in the latter half of the 1800s, but enforcement was inconsistent and exemptions were common. Many employers simply ignored them. There was no federal right to organize. Workers who joined unions or attempted to organize strikes could be fired immediately. They frequently were. Some employers kept blacklist records of workers who had tried to organize and shared them with other businesses in the industry. A worker who ended up on one of these lists could find themselves effectively unemployable in their field. Employers also used other methods of control. The company town was one of them. In industries like coal mining, where the work happened in remote areas, mining companies often owned the town surrounding the mine. They owned the housing. They owned the stores. Workers were paid sometimes in company scrip, a form of currency that could only be spent at company-owned establishments. This created a situation where a worker could work a full year and end up in debt to the company. Housing, food, and equipment costs were deducted directly from wages, often at prices set by the company itself. If you owed more than you'd earned, you couldn't simply leave you owed a debt first. This wasn't slavery, but it was a form of economic dependency that left workers with very limited freedom of movement. Workers who organized strikes or protests faced serious consequences. In several documented cases, employers hired private security firms to break up strikes by force. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was one of the most well-known examples. During the Homestead Strike of 1892, a major steel strike at a Carnegie plant in Pennsylvania, Pinkerton agents were brought in and a violent confrontation resulted in deaths on both sides. The state militia was later called in to break the strike. The workers lost, and the plant went back to its original wages and conditions. This was the balance of power that defined industrial America for most of the 19th century. Change did not come because employers decided to treat workers better. It came because workers organized, pushed, and refused to stop pushing over decades through strikes and protests and political campaigns, often at serious personal cost. The labor movement in America grew slowly throughout the second half of the 1800s. Organizations like the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, pushed for an 8-hour workday, equal pay, and the abolition of child labor. At its peak in the mid-1880s, the Knights had more than 700,000 members, a significant number for that era. The American Federation of Labor, formed in 1886, took a more pragmatic approach. Rather than pushing for broad social change, it focused on winning concrete improvements in wages, hours, and conditions through collective bargaining. It grew steadily through the early 1900s. The push for change also came from journalists and investigators who brought working conditions into public view. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel documenting conditions inside Chicago's meatpacking industry. While the book was intended as a critique of economic exploitation, readers were most shocked by the descriptions of the physical conditions of the meat itself. The public outcry contributed to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act that same year. Jacob Riis, a photographer and journalist, published How the Other Half Lives in 1890, documenting the living and working conditions of immigrant families in New York City's tenements. His photographs brought conditions that many middle-class Americans had never seen into direct view. The Triangle Fire of 1911 accelerated reform efforts in New York State significantly. Frances Perkins, who witnessed the fire from the street and later became the first female U.S. cabinet member, worked for years afterward on labor reform. She described the Triangle Fire as the moment that defined her professional life. The Progressive Era, roughly 1890 to 1920, saw a significant expansion of state-level labor protections. Many states passed laws limiting working hours for women. Some passed early versions of workers' compensation. A growing number of states moved to restrict child labor. Federal protections were still largely absent. The most significant shift came in the 1930s, during the Great Depression. The Depression was an economic collapse of a scale most Americans had never experienced. Unemployment reached roughly 25% at its peak. Millions of people who had worked steadily their entire adult lives found themselves with nothing. The fragility of the system became impossible to ignore. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, beginning in 1933, introduced a series of federal programs and laws that reshaped the relationship between employers, workers, and the government. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also called the Wagner Act, established the legal right of workers to organize unions and engage in collective bargaining without being fired for doing so. For the first time, there was federal protection for the act of organizing itself. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set a federal minimum wage for the first time in American history. The initial rate was 25 cents per hour. It also established the 40-hour